Hello and welcome to this event. This is the fifth in our series on how to make homes cleaner and greener. And today the title of our event is Devolve to Evolve. What role should local communities play in decarbonising homes? My name is Ravi Gurumurthy. I'm the Chief Executive of Nesta. Nesta is the Innovation Agency for Social Good. And we've set three missions in our strategy, one of which is about a sustainable future, which is really all about decarbonising households in our main area of focus. So this is a very interesting issue for us. We've got four speakers who are going to come from quite different perspectives, who I'll introduce in a second. But let me just say a little bit about the actual subject matter. I spent quite a lot of time in my career focused on climate change. I was involved in shaping the Climate Change Act about 15 years ago, and then responsible for trying to think about how the UK meets its carbon reduction targets. And it's striking how 10 years ago, if you'd have talked about the role of local authorities, people would have probably not spent much time on that question. It was a very national issue. The Climate Change Act, the responsibilities set out in it were really for national governments and various agencies. I think now there is a much bigger question about communities, local governments, and bottom-up action, and that's what we want to try and get into today. And with us to discuss this, we've got Laura Sanders, who is the CEO of Challenging Ideas. She chaired the BEIS Energy Data Task Force and is a NED at Energy Systems Catapult. We have Chaitanya Kumar, who's the Head of Environment and Green Transition at the New Economics Foundation. We have Louise Marix-Evans, who's the Director of Quantum Strategy and Technology. And we have Luke Murphy, who's the head of the Environmental Justice Commission and the Associate Director for Energy, Climate, Housing and Infrastructure at the Institute for Public Policy Research. So a great welcome to our speakers. What we're going to do today is I'm going to kick off with 2 or 3 questions for the panel. We'll then go to your questions that you're posting either in the comments box via YouTube or LinkedIn. And we'll bring the speakers in on them. So do feel free to post questions at any point during the conversation. So let me start with the first provocation, which is really about how the UK's heat and building strategy that was launched had relatively little to say about the role of local government and community organisations in decarbonising homes. Is this an oversight? To what extent is home decarbonisation going to be driven by local action, and what role should local actors be playing? So let me go to Laura to kick off on that.
Thanks, Ravi. Well, I think when we start to get into the heat debate, we start to really, what I would call, the rubber hits the road when it comes to customers, when it comes to location. And I will say location, location, location when it comes to heat. And we're going to have to look at lots of differentials within localities as well. But, you know, if you're in a block of flats, that's a different potential solution to those people who are in more suburban areas. And so in many ways, I think that there should be a very significant impact and participation by local authorities. At the Catapult, we're doing the local energy plans for localities, which actually then starts to help zone areas, and then also put something that sometimes local action doesn't quite capture, and that is customer choice. I mean, these aren't things that we can just impose on people. And so we need to zone areas according to what sort of heat strategy is possible, and then engage human beings, which the energy sector is not so great at, in actually those solutions. So we definitely need locality-specific solutions. But that's not to say that we don't need national government and we don't need a very strong coordinating role, which is actually supporting local authorities.
Thank you very much, Laura. Chaitanya.
Great. Thanks, Ravi. I think you're right that the heat and building strategy does miss out on what the role of local authorities ought to be. It certainly does talk about the importance of them, but it doesn't give much steer, guidance, or direction on what local authorities could be doing. I'd argue, obviously, they have a very key role to play. some of the reasons why we often talk about why local authorities are a better place to deal with home retrofitting specifically is the notion that they understand the constituencies better. They understand, who perhaps is closer to fuel poverty or is in fuel poverty, or other aspects of the demographic that they're in charge of, which leads to solutions around better targeting of support, as we're seeing currently with some of the cost of living crisis questions on how do we target support measures. There's a key question of the role for local authorities there, and the same would apply, I argue, for retrofitting homes as well. And I think a key element that doesn't get talked about that much in terms of their role is how do we actually capture the benefits and retain the benefits, because we talk a lot about the macro benefits of retrofitting, be it in terms of public health, in terms of local supply chains, in terms of added GVA, things of that nature. How do we ensure that a lot of that is captured at the local level, at the community level, so the benefits of scaling up retrofitting are actually felt by people in that community? I think that's a key question. We haven't really cracked that, largely because we just haven't achieved the kind of scale that we need to on retrofitting. But local authorities, combined authorities, or local institutions, basically, I think, have a key role to play there as well. And just looking at some of the schemes that we've seen so far, I think the LAD scheme, or the local authority delivery scheme that has been running for the last couple of years, I think is a good example of a scheme that has seen some success, albeit cumulative effect of what the scheme has achieved in terms of carbon reductions is still to pan out. It's still minimal, but it does give an indication of what local authorities could be doing. And the same would apply to the other schemes, such as the energy company obligation, which is at this moment in time perhaps the only main policy that we've got with some significant funding from national government on home retrofitting. And an increasing chunk of that scheme is being devolved to local authorities to try and manage. I think the last I checked, it was about 25%. That jumped from about 10-15% to 25%. So we're obviously acknowledging that local authorities have a very important role in home retrofitting, and we are carving out more and more funding for that to happen. You speak of examples. I could perhaps get to the examples in a bit, but there are tons of examples. I'd only point listeners, viewers, to a neat little map that the UK Green Building Council put together of key interventions and programs that local authorities and combined authorities are undertaking in the UK. It's definitely worth a look, because there are lots of schemes organically come up that are above and beyond the national policy-driven schemes that we see.
Thank you very much. Louise, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think to answer your question, is it an oversight, the sort of missing out that local action? Yeah, I think it is. I think that community or local based piece is really important to establish norms. It's not normal to do retrofit, and to establish a sort of market demand in a particular area that's appropriate, like Laura was saying, that's appropriate to that area or that housing type and the tenure. And that needs to reflect what the plans for the local energy system are going to be. Is it going to be district heating? Is it going to be on hydrogen? Or are we looking at heat pumps in the main? And if we get that sort of agglomeration locally, we build much more cost-effective options. And we critically, like Chaitanya was just saying, we build that local supply chain and we keep that value and that skill local. So I think doing things with people in the local area, again, makes us feel more empowered than seeing it as an individual action that's a really big issue that we might need to tackle. But we do need that national stability to sort of provide that policy that overarches it, that builds that steady market and will come on to local area energy planning. And I think we overestimate in a way what the council role is. They've got a stronger role on rental properties, social housing and council houses, but very little influence over owner-occupiers. And the reason I'm sat here in a big coat is I'm actually on an away day with People Powered Retrofit, which is a new scheme based in Greater Manchester, but aimed at owner-occupiers and providing that end-to-end retrofit service and building a local market and local supply chain that makes it easier for people to act. So, yeah, I think the local is critical and the strong national-local link is vital.
Thank you. Great. And finally, Luke.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think we're all in danger of vigorous agreement between all of us, because I agree with everything that's been said, and I think for three reasons. One is, I think if you step back and ask the question slightly different, because I think slightly differently, because we always seem to ask, how much of this we should devolve. When you think about the net zero debate, as Laura was saying, where the rubber hits the road, we're moving from decarbonising in the background to potentially the most invasive aspect of decarbonisation that is going to touch on people's lives, and we've got to decarbonise 23 million. Well, there's 23 million homes in England, and the vast majority of them will need some work. Is it sensible to try and coordinate that from one department in Whitehall? I mean, I think obviously the answer is no, and therefore it is a huge oversight within the heated building strategy. So that's the first point, and that also relates to what the public want, which is my second point, which is the work we did as part of the Environmental Justice Commission at IPPR, which Laura was one of the co-chairs of. We held 4 citizens' juries across the country asking what the public wanted and what they thought a fair approach to the transition looked like. And as Louise mentioned, and Titania mentioned as well, and Laura, they told us they wanted more control, they want more agency and involvement in this transition. Now, this clearly cannot be delivered by Whitehall. It has to be and can only be delivered by organisations that sit and know within and also know their communities. In the words of our Tees Valley jurors, one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. In the words of our South Wales Valley's jurors, they said more decisions should be made at a local level, and the uniqueness of each place should be recognised in the decision-making. And so that's the kind of second reason. And the third is just, as Chatty said, actually, practically, some of the best examples of this happening has been at the local level. The local authority delivery scheme has been progressing really well. In Wales, a combination of the area-based scheme, RBED, and also a kind of national advice service in Nest, are generally considered to be, more successful, for example, in reaching out to fuel poor homes. So, in answer to the question, yes, it's an oversight, but I would, we need a much greater role for local authorities. But I would also agree with what others have said, is that doesn't negate the need for a strong driving standard and strategy and some coordination at the national level. But we have to see greater devolution in this area if we're going to make the progress at the speed that we want, and also ensure that it's a process that involves the public and is ultimately fair as well.
Can I just push you though, Luke? On you said that a one-size-fits-all approach can't be delivered. You can't do this from Whitehall. But why can't you? Because in some ways, national government puts in place subsidies and taxes to try and incentivize heat pumps, for instance, or retrofitting, and then consumers can either utilize those or not, or work with their energy companies to get retrofits done. So why does it really need a collective action or even a role for local governments? Why can't we just leave it to retailers, energy companies, and national government?
I think it's already been mentioned. Actually, one of the key roles, as others have said, is this notion of kind of heat zoning and mapping an area and understanding the different types of houses and the different areas. And actually, the solutions will be different in different areas. In some areas, it's heat pumps. In some areas, it's going to be heat networks. In others, there will be a small role for hydrogen as well in some limited areas. And I think the only way in which you can the only body that is able to do that kind of coordinating role is local authorities. Now, that doesn't mean that, obviously, that one of the other things that Drew has said is it's got to be a whole economy, whole society approach. Clearly, it can't be local authorities in isolation either. It has to be national government. It has to be businesses innovating, providing the finance and delivering on the ground. So it's not local authority. Yes, there is a huge role for the market, absolutely, just as there is for the state. But we would argue that there needs to be a much bigger role probably for both the national state and actually the local state than there is at the moment. So yeah, I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, but it's not that you couldn't deliver it without local authorities. I think, but can you deliver it at the pace we need? Can you deliver one that's fair? Can you deliver it in a way which empowers people and ensure that people feel like they have agency and control without local authorities? I would say no, you couldn't.
Go for it, Laura.
Yes, no, I just wanted to sort of reiterate what Luke was saying, but also, we've got examples of this. Whether it be Manchester, London, who are starting this coordination role, bringing everybody together, bringing the key players together, and working out what the pathway is. I think that when you start to, having sort of represented in a very small local authority called Thanet in Kent, I would say that they might not have the capability for this. And actually, as a result, maybe there are sort of, whether it be counties and cities that actually start doing this coordination, working with their local authorities. But this does need coordination. And if you think, I mean, sort of counties and cities, they coordinate our transport system, which offers you optionality, whether you want to, you know, jump on a bus, or you've got a metro, or there's a tram system. And that is in some ways the sort of conducting role that local authorities can play. But to fill into the space that they create, the planning and the overall strategy, there really needs to be new business models that actually understand human beings and choice. There needs to be, as you rightly say, about supply chains need to be built up. And we also need both local authorities and national authorities to set standards and enforcement. We are now moving into people's homes, and there will be, you know, mess ups in people's homes. They need redress, they need trust, and they need confidence. And that is something that both at national level and local trading standards will have to be engaged with.
So I think we're violently agreeing on the need to devolve power and have more action capacity at a level below the national government. But can we now get into what power and capacity is needed, and also at what level? Because this is where I think there might be legitimate disagreement. And Laura, you indicated that maybe cities and city regions might be the right appropriate level rather than smaller local authorities. And you know, I think there's a strong argument actually for that for other reasons. For instance, if you're thinking about the future of the electricity grid and how much to invest in the national grid or the distribution network, that's actually something which is often at a regional level really rather than a very local level. So where should we devolve power to? Should we be thinking about combined authorities, regions, or should we be going much, much more local? Laura, do you want to just follow up on that, and then we'll bring others in?
I'll follow up on it. I mean, the point about the coordination is I think that does need to be at a little higher than a sort of average local authority. That doesn't mean to say that the local authority isn't there determining the strategy for that particular area, but the capabilities and the skills, and to be frank, that coordination job is going to be needed just at a little bit bigger than that locality area. To be frank, I would want to see people involved, not just local authorities, and in many ways really get to communities rather than institutions. But I see frequently sort of particularly county councils working very closely with their local authorities, and it's about that partnership. But I think the skills have to sit, or will be probably easier to sit at a sort of county stroke city regional authority level.
Yeah, I think there is this tension, isn't there, between, as you say, the need for skills and capacity to sit probably at a higher level, given how scarce they are, and also the need for planning often to happen at that higher level, but also the desire to actually be more engaging with communities, which often involves going more down to neighbourhoods and localities. Chaitanya, I'm sure you've thought about this, given Nef's perspective on these issues, and are you more on the ultra-local side of this debate?
Yes, I think given Nef's history and Nef's legacy, we're all about community wealth building, and how do we sort of ensure the social value of capital is exported a lot more. I think we're working at this very moment with the Combined Authority, the South Yorkshire Combined Authority, actually just thinking through some of the options on what a retrofit strategy might look like that is largely driven by the Combined Authority. And we know West Yorkshire and a few other combined authorities are very much, Greater Manchester, for example, are certainly thinking about this quite actively. There are a lot of issues to pick on, but one that really comes up consistently, which Laura was sort of alluding to right at the end, is the point about skills. I think a case in point would be, getting suppliers to get past the sort of past 2035 standard, which is this trademark standard that you basically want all your suppliers to be able to meet and therefore deliver the retrofit or the insulation measure or what have you to a certain standard. And there are clear barriers that suppliers have at this point. One is cost, of course, but generally sort of the technicalities behind it all makes it quite difficult. So is there a role perhaps there for the combined authority that acts on behalf of local authorities and allows suppliers to pull them in and remove some of those barriers potentially and allow a lot more suppliers into the market to deal with the supply crunch or skills crunch? And to zoom out of that, the one thing we've argued quite recently in a paper that we published on leveling up, broadly thinking about leveling up and where skills fits into that. We want to make the case of fully devolving the adult education budget. Some combined authorities do have that at this point, but I think we can go further in fully devolving that. That's one. The lifelong learning loan scheme that exists here, that could be devolved as well. There is a clear underspend in the apprenticeship levy scheme that we've got, albeit it's got some issues already, but there's also an underspend there. Devolving that again to combined authorities to essentially build the local skill system and training offer, and like I said, removing some of those barriers for local suppliers, I think is quite key. And the final thing on skills, there's also obviously a clear need to sort of scale up local apprenticeships and job guarantee schemes. I think if you can think about skills broadly in the context of the fact that every job ought to be a green job, by the time we hit net zero, how do we think about the wider skills package, not just focused on retrofit, but thinking about the larger economy as well, and therefore questions on local apprenticeships, jobs, guarantee schemes, etc. I think become quite critical. And how do we target them and deprive troops of those, who are finding it difficult to sort of access training while in work, the income challenges that we know or well aware of that a lot of workers have, i.e. Losing out on income while actually going to go get trained elsewhere. These are all challenges that apply to the retrofit sector or the construction sector in general, but also to the wider economy. So therefore, we need to have a more holistic approach, a more sort of zoomed out approach, looking not just at retrofit, but the wider low carbon economy as well.
Thank you. Louise, what's your take on what needs to happen at what level? Local versus regional?
This is what I spent 2020 thinking about. So yeah, please just read my reports on that. The Committee on Climate Change one, and one called Powers. It's called Power Shift. We analysed what powers local authorities have and don't have, and where some of the key gaps are and how to get to net zero. And that picked up on buildings. And actually, I just referred back to that. There's a big gap around local area energy planning. It's not something anyone in planning or development planning does. Local authorities aren't able to plan ahead on that kind of infrastructure investment and align that with the district distribution network organisations. And then a bunch of them are constrained by Ofgem and by market problems as well. So we've got the sort of, we need to bring that local area energy planning involving people into planning and then have it in the planning system with skilled planners who know how to say to a big housing developer, this is the area energy plan for this area, you've got to build to it. And we come back to viability, which is the big thing that cripples everybody from building new build to decent standards that align with net zero, and they're going too slow.
Sorry, Louise, can I just jump in and ask you about local area energy planning and just bring it to life for us in terms of how that could work? Because one can imagine, some analysis done on local housing stock and energy supply, but how does it then actually translate into action?
Well, that's key, Ravi, because we've got local area energy plans. They've been trialled by Energy Systems Catapult and CSE. We did the methodology for really good ones. We've seen them being done in Scotland. They're a bit different, the local heat and energy efficiency strategies, and they align to their energy efficiency programme HEAPS, which is like the sort of Welsh one Luke mentioned. It's good. And it links national and local. So they're bringing housing and energy together there. We've kind of got an approach to sort of piloting local area energy plans in different ways using different methodologies, and then they kind of sort of sit there. They're kind of useful. Stockport tried. They heat mapped their area. They said, here's where you'd install renewables, here's where you might do something else, but they could never really leverage it because it didn't sit within the planning system properly in a recognised way. So that's a big gap and a big problem that needs tackling. So what do they mean? What do they mean to a real planner is a thing I'd ask. And what do they mean to someone having a retrofit project done? So they could sit too high and be too theoretical with some housing stock survey, or they could start translating into action, as we see in Bristol with Bristol City Leap and their big investment to bring in a lot of money and a lot of action and link that into district heating and housing retrofit. So it's starting to come to life there, but they're running ahead of national policy. So coming on to, I think, something we'll discuss later, which is what the risks are. You're kind of going into risky territory because you might be running ahead of a decision that might swamp you later. And certainly in Leeds, they've been sort of going, "Ooh, are we going to go ahead? And are we going to end up sailing too early, and then another policy kind of swamping us, meaning we're stranding assets or stranding customers in a way we shouldn't?" So it is really, really complicated, and I'm not very clear communicator. One of the other things I think should be really strongly devolved is the ability to have much better EPCs. Much more monitoring and control over them, and landlord registration, a lot more work around the private rental sector where we see some really poor quality housing. So, and I think we need to bring together the energy efficiency and the heat piece, because we see a lot of one-trick organisations. Just put in a heat pump, just do insulation, just do that. And we're talking about a really complex project on every house. And we have to have really good service design to lead the homeowner or the tenant through that process in a people-centered way, which is what we're trying to do through really good service design to overcome not just the financial barriers, but the kind of information barriers of being really given really complex information about what retrofit might mean or what heat decarbonisation might look like. And you've got all these suppliers telling you something different. So what's a homeowner to do? So having that independent sort of approach and some really good assessment of the houses is also needed. Sorry, too much to talk about. I'll shut up.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Luke.
Thanks. I mean, I think a lot of the points have already been made. So I think that the thing I would say is just, depending on the area, like each area needs the right amount of capacity, resources, and leadership. And actually, we don't necessarily always have to be completely dogmatic about kind of exactly the level. Like if not least because some local authorities at different levels will have more resources and capacity to do this than others, and will have greater desire and leadership to do it. So actually, and there is an advantage, although Louise has identified one of the challenges, is that doing it at different levels will allow certain amounts of innovation, which can then be rolled out elsewhere. I agree with Jati that actually doing it in a way that ensures that as much as possible the benefits accrue to local communities and local people is definitely desirable, but I think it might look differently in different places. So I don't think we necessarily have to be dogmatic exactly what level, albeit there is some kind of benefit to a kind of consistent devolution framework, but it could still allow some flexibility in different places because some areas, it will depend on some areas' leadership and desire to do some of these things. So I think it's it will depend on the area.
But do you see, Luke, areas able to make a go of this just through sort of soft power and leadership and convening, or do they actually need formal, harder levers to actually drive this forward?
I think there's definitely a role for convening. You could argue that the London Mayor has got a housing retrofit summit upcoming, and the very act of bringing together local authorities, housing associations, financial organisations, and funders can kind of can help and absolutely ensure the right conversations are happening, ensuring that that the different organisations are sharing information and helping kind of convene and coordinate in a way that can kind of hopefully catalyse progress. That being said, it is quite often useful if that is then underpinned by the ability to kind of make things happen, either through kind of legal powers or having additional resources and budget to kind of to co-fund elements. And I think so. Yes, convening has a role, but it can always be added to through having kind of additional capacity and resources at whatever level.
Okay, great. Does anyone want to say more about almost what specifically they see local government doing in terms of the powers or levers that they need, and how much sort of change to existing institutions does that require? So, for instance, I'm worried that distribution network operators will always have an interest in building more wires, which actually undermines the need and the case for doing demand side response. So if you're in that situation, do you not need to have some ability to control the degree of investment that happen through those DNOs, which local government doesn't currently have? So what actual formal powers do we really need? Louise, you're sort of violently disagreeing.
Oh yeah, I violently disagreed with you there. I think distribution network operators spend a lot of time trying not to invest in their wires. So I'm thinking about Electricity Northwest. They'd probably kick me under the table if we were in the same room, but they're thinking about how they can align their net zero target, that of Greater Manchester, and obviously they're across a bigger area with Cumbria and other bits and bobs, Lancashire. They're looking at how to do things more smartly, how to introduce flexibility, how to there's a program about developing a local energy market. So they're much more interested in balancing and constraining and what they can do to play with that flexibility to avoid having to dig up wires and shove yet more in, and to build resilience into their network as well. I mean, we saw with Storm Arwen massive power outages, which are unusual, but they're already thinking about those more constrained areas and how they could build in storage that means they could power areas that are cut off. So I think they're potentially a really good partner in a smarter local energy market which picks up heat and transport decarbonisation, but that they're kind of constrained by their annual plan, their Rio, whatever that means. That they're sort of 3 or 4 year business plans, and they have to spend ages on that and then get it approved by Ofgem. They don't align with the gas network, who've got different sort of planning cycles. So I think something to sort of shake them all up and align them nicely, so everyone's working through a national sort of pathway towards net zero that's aligned for what's appropriate in the local area, that's still fair, that's still got customer protection, and has got that environmental justice piece in, and that aligns to what's planned for buildings. It all needs kind of triangulating together. And I think we almost saw the beginning of how that could start happening in the net zero strategy with the local net zero forum, but we haven't seen that formed yet. And we don't know who else is on it, whether it's just local authorities or we'll get some of those Ofgem thinkers in there. So yeah, I think we need to see some quite fast innovation allowed. And try this out in practice, not just theories.
Laura, did you want to come in?
Yes, no, I was sort of just coming back a little bit to Luke's point about what responsibilities in some ways local authorities should have. I mean, sometimes I think everybody, including our regulators, don't realise that there's something called net zero legislation, i.e., this is in law, guys, wakey. Everybody, local authorities absolutely require responsibilities, and there needs to be timelines on where they're getting to in terms of their planning, as do the regulators, as do the companies who are involved in the energy sector. So let's have that in some ways very high level, but accountability that sits with national government. Then that responsibility sits with local governments to deliver. And they will always, and I totally agree with Luke, there'll always be fast runners and then there will be the slower guys, and also some areas that will actually require some really difficult work, which isn't quite the same as, you know, a sort of suburban area. But also picking up on your point about networks and how you do planning. One of the things that we haven't really looked at, and I think is going to be introduced, is, to be really geeky, is this localized nodal pricing, localized pricing that's coming in potentially for the DNOs, and that local authorities could use that very localized constraint pricing, surge pricing, etc., to actually unlock that locality, either from a demand side, so we end up with, you know, more exciting consumer propositions that help with demand, or a supply side, because what they say is actually we need more generation in this area. And that takes a much more textured understanding of how the market can work in that locality than anybody either sitting at Ofgem or at national government. But it requires skills and it requires capabilities. And that's why through some reports I did with Imperial College, we talked about local optimizers who actually have no financial interest in the area, but actually pull on demand, supply, constraints, and optimize their locality, utilizing sometimes industry, because industry's got a lot of wasted heat, etc., etc.
Thank you. Let me just ask one final question of the panel, and I'm going to come to the questions that are coming through the chat. So do stick them in. My final sort of question for the panel really is about the risks. So what do you see as the main risks of pushing for more devolution of power to localities over this agenda? Who wants to jump in? Luke, why don't you come in, as I've drawn on you last most of the time?
Thanks. I mean, I think some of them have already been mentioned. I mean, I guess there's the capacity issue, which I think is already mentioned. Like, you know, we do need to ensure that we're not just kind of devolving responsibility without resources and capacity being there at the local level, which is something that's kind of a common theme across a lot of forms of government policy. So that's the first thing. The second of all is to ensure that any kind of devolution doesn't lead to kind of confusion amongst consumers. You know, consumers are and households are time pressed, don't necessarily have a huge amount of time to invest in these things. So actually there is an argument for common consistency in standards. I know Louise earlier was saying about kind of potentially different EPC ratings in different areas. I think that's something to explore, and I can see some benefit to that, but I will also be concerned about if you have very different regulations across different local areas, it could potentially become confusing for consumers. I mean, I would say that any kind of devolution needs to be supported by very clear information from government. You know, we argued in our commission for a kind of, you know, really clear communications campaign, a nationally funded scheme for consumers, but with a locally led kind of rollout for delivery. So, you know, capacity is one, potential confusion for consumers the other, and then lastly, I would guess is something else that's also been mentioned is the local authorities. You know, the laggards. And there will be some that will be resistant to do it for whatever reasons, because they have other priorities. But that's always a risk with devolution. And one of the advantages is that you'll have some that will go much faster, which is why you do need a kind of national backstop, I think, to kind of with clear legal targets for when things need to happen by. But then local authorities can make decisions about how best these things are delivered in their local area. So I guess those are just three of the things. So I guess one final thing, which something we've called for, is a kind of single hub within government to provide support for local authorities that want to do this at a local level as well.
Thank you, Louise. Did you really call for different EPCs?
No. Sorry.
I
wasn't doing that. Unsay that. I think what I was saying was that we need we need a better approach to coming up with EPCs, because you can drive a cart and horse through it at the moment. You know, you can do one day and it's a B, and then 2 days later you can do it again, it'd be a D. So more rigorous, I think, and I think it's being reviewed actually, EPCs at the moment. So I wasn't calling on different ones in different areas or a different standard. I do think there needs to be maybe more devolution of the ability to monitor those things, though, you know, so that you aren't renting houses out at substandard, and that at those trigger points someone in the local authority can come in and inspect. But that's getting, yeah. I'm kind of just clarifying on this. I did write a list of some of the risks of a locally led approach, which was, one of them is you go in and you invest massively in something and it costs more because you're doing it first, and then you've got a risk of, if you do something, if you devolve without the guidance or the framework that sits around it nationally, you could end up putting something in that either disadvantages the householders or customers living there, but then you could end up with the risk of a stranded asset, and that's sort of what holds us back from acting. You've also got a risk of going too early and a very efficient new market entrant taking over and sort of swamping you. So you go fast, you buy the wrong thing, like Betamax versus VHS. And you're risking people's property values. You're risking quite a lot if you get these things wrong, I think. So that's why we do need a decent plan that gives a firm policy that's clear at the national level, and then enough devolution to deliver, but in an agreed way where they've discussed it together, not just having that devolution dumped on you without the capacity or without the kind of direction. But the direction has to be agreed with the local and national, not just dictated by the national. And I think that's what we often see, and that's why we get substandard policy. That's not done to the highest quality standards either. We kind of go for the low bar, like being a member of Trustmark, instead of something that's a really high quality thing that we want that's managed locally. But there are ways of we can mitigate those risks by working together and by learning what's going well at the moment. So how is Bristol going to get on? How are some of the pilots doing? And then having a feedback loop. We often see pilots and then we never hear about them again. What did they do? What did we learn? Getting that feedback loop, feeding into policy, honestly, without just abandoning things. We're good at abandoning things in this country. We had Green Homes Grant. Whoops, it didn't work. We binned it. We should have adjusted it because it had the basis of something good. So it's more about the way you do the devolution than as well as the what you devolve.
Thanks. Chatty.
I think just building on the point Louise was making on costs, certainly it is an issue. Largely, we just haven't seen scale being achieved anywhere. No part of the country, as far as I know, is doing retrofit at scale that is therefore seeing the benefits of economies of scale and cost reductions as a result. And therefore we aren't seeing supply chains, etc. That's how the story goes. So I think cost, therefore, is it's a key challenge, but can be overcome if you achieve some of the scale that we need. But to sort of think about it differently, if you deem this issue, the climate crisis, an emergency, as a lot of these local authorities have basically passed motions saying the same, then perhaps we can accept some dead weight associated with this. Perhaps we can throw some money at things that might go to waste, but ultimately we might get significant reductions in terms of carbon emissions at a much faster pace. I'd be interested in that. That's what we've done, I suppose, in the COVID crisis. We did chuck a lot of money because we knew we were dealing with an emergency here and now. And without drawing too many parallels between that and climate change, but that's one parallel that might be worth exploring a bit further. So cost is an issue, no doubt, but perhaps there is merit in chucking a lot of money at this because we know it's a crisis. But on the points you've want to touch on in terms of mitigation of the risks and challenges, Just 3 points to build on what Louise and Luke were spoken of. One is on the potential for combined authorities to act as aggregators. Seeing some examples and trials as we speak. In London, there's an example that the Green Finance Institute is running. The goal is to sort of aggregate demand from different housing types and pool that demand, and you offer a bulk purchase or a bulk order. Hopefully will reduce some of the costs associated with insulation, retrofitting, etc. So the notion of demand aggregation, I think, is quite interesting. There's also that's a mitigating effect on costs or higher costs. There's also the point about local contractors getting past the PAS 35 standard and accreditation. I already mentioned that before. I think there's a lot of work that local authorities and combined authorities could be doing there. And perhaps the final thing is in terms of procurement. We haven't spoken much about it, but there is certainly a role for procurement practices at the local authority level or combined authority level, where we could drive again a lot of the supply chain and the cost reductions that we need to see here and mitigate some of the risks of a locally led approach. As I mentioned before, we're working in South Yorkshire, and Barnsley, which is a local authority there, is trying out what is called dynamic procurement systems, DPS. That's an interesting model. It's been successful, and a lot of local authorities are trying it out in terms of procuring suppliers, a list of sort of pool of reliable suppliers that can deliver to the standard that we need them to deliver. I think that model again needs to be scaled up, I'd argue.
Great, thanks. Finally, Laura, any risks and how can we mitigate them?
Very quickly, everyone has covered off so much, but I think there is one thing, and that is we mustn't mistake the fact that people don't like things being done to them. And sometimes that is as much an accusation against local authorities as it is about central authorities. So it's absolutely crucial. You've got, in some instances, places that you might call carry-on council, and you would not trust them to be the intermediary to your decision making. So I think that's really, really important, that it's communities and people, not just institutions. One little solution, which I know Luke and I've talked about many times and is being really pushed in Northern Ireland, and that is that every town would have a one-stop shop, which would be set up with absolute common information, pathways for consumers, understanding exactly what their rights are, what the opportunities and what their options are. And I think if that came from an independent voice, funded by central government, you would actually start to deliver a little bit more consumer activity and action, which will be absolutely counter some of those more aggressive and sort of top down, even though it's a local authority, onto people's choices.
Great, let's go to the questions that are coming in. And funnily enough, following on what Laura said, there's a few in there about community ownership. So one from Emily Mason about what are the best ways to get people and communities involved. And I think it's a particularly interesting question with regard to energy and climate change, because some of this is quite technical in nature, particularly when you get into energy planning. So I'd be interested in anyone's examples actually of where they've seen this done well, and any thoughts on what localities can do to improve that. I don't know who wants to come in. Can I perhaps ask Louise to come in?
It's quite broad. Communities involved. I'll take it from a retro. Well, I mean, we've seen citizens' juries and events like the Green Summit that we run in Greater Manchester, which have got people and communities involved in the climate change discussion more widely. And then the approach that, just going back right down to the local level, that we've taken with people powered retrofit is to take we've mapped out certain areas of where people are more likely, homeowners are more likely to take up retrofit measures, and we're using social marketing, community-based marketing to get to those people. We're actually not doing much marketing because we've got such demand anyway. But the approach there is, say Luke has his house retrofitted. He has a nice sign up, like a little for sale sign saying, I've had my house retrofitted. And then little Luke's neighbours go, well, Luke, how was that? Looks interesting. That builder seemed really nice. Can we come round? We have a look. We go, oh, blimey, this looks great. Let's do that. So you've got that peer-to-peer piece going. And that's what they do in the States, in lots of their really successful energy efficiency schemes, very much area-based. So I will listen to people like me. And then that might be backed up by my local authority. So Devon County Council are starting to do a retrofit project, which we're supporting actually. And so they'll be like the trusted partner, sort of that they will make sure people are properly trained and that it's communicated, but then it'll be delivered at a very local level by community energy organisations who have been trained in home retrofit planner. And then they will have supply chain engagement as well. So they'll have reliable contractors to do the work. So again, it's not sort of one leaflet through the door. It's involving people in different conversations. That's just for retrofit. But I think another way to involve people, I think we go back to the Futura rules that were kicking around a long time ago. We don't scare the hell out of everybody without giving them agency. So talk about it, but then talk about what we can do collectively. And we come at it in different ways. We run a repair cafe in our village. We don't talk about climate change particularly. We repair stuff and then people start thinking about it. And so there are different hooks in. So I think it's important to have that community engagement. And in fact, actually Involve and My Society are people about to start a new project with local authorities on just that. So I think there's no point just doing it for the sake of it unless people have got some enabling measures and agency to act.
Thank you. James Noakes asked, what do we mean by local communities? Specific geographies or other definitions? I think we are largely in this conversation talking geographically, but it is an interesting question about what you can do with particular segments like private renters. Dave Alquist has asked, we have a network of some 2,000 community hubs in our membership, buildings embedded in communities. What do the panel see as the potential role for these if they could be coordinated? Laura, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yes, I mean, I think that, they all sound, really exciting. It sounds like a sort of interesting national movement. But I think that when you look at those community hubs, again, really picking up on Louise's point, you need to start where the public is, not where you sort of want to push them into. And so you've got to take them on the journey. And as 2,000 community hubs of, I presume, around the country, it's about trialing some engagement opportunities and trialing ways that work and finding out ways that don't work. I mean, most importantly is we're under a lot of time pressure when it comes to our climate change requirements. I would say fail fast. But learn something from failing. So I would do 3 or 4 different pilots across your 2,000, see how you can engage them and also bring them together. I think they will find that very powerful, feeling that there was a national grouping that actually shared some of the same values.
Anyone else want to come in on that one? Yeah, Luke.
Yeah, well, quickly, if that's all right. I mean, I think there's that resource of having all those community hubs can make a huge difference, as Laura was saying. I think someone mentioned actually earlier in the chat or in the comments about Swaffham Prior, which is a really great example of a community-led organisation that kind of is helping to deliver a really innovative heat scheme in its local area, and that's one of many. Actually, I'm going to share a report in the private chat. Hopefully it can be posted or sent around afterwards, around community climate action, which showed what can be done at community level on food growing, on heat decarbonisation, on energy efficiency, on community renewables. Now, that's not going to be right in every community, but where areas want to take that action, then they should be provided with the support and resources to be able to do that, because they might be running ahead of their local authority, or indeed what we're doing at national level. And I think that the point Louise made there about how you communicate is really key. Like the work we did looking at community climate action showed that particularly in areas where they are potentially more deprived, some of their motivations for getting involved was actually far more about reducing their energy bills, ensuring that they were living in warmer homes, rather than the climate action. And the co-benefit, if you like, was the opposite of what environmentalists often talk about, was actually the emissions reductions. But over time, they've begun to see how what they're doing can reduce their energy bills and also help tackle climate change as well. So thinking about how you communicate with the public and communicate with the communities is really important. And the really great advantage of community schemes like that is they often see, as Chatty was talking about earlier, these benefits being accrued by the local community rather than by a distant supplier. And then just one other thing to kind of refer back to the other thing about engaging the public. It was clear through the citizens' juries that we held. We held 4 across the country: Tees Valley, Aberdeenshire, South Wales Valleys and Thurrock, all very different areas. The public do want to be engaged and they want more information about this. Not everyone is going to have the time or the ability to engage fully or get involved in schemes. That's not, there's going to be different levels for what people want. But so at a basic level, people want more information. They want to understand more about what's available, what help's available, what changes they can make, and that could be through the one-stop shops that Laura mentioned. And then there's the next level of the kind of deliberation and engagement, the citizens' juries, which we think local authorities should be employing much more broadly, looking at different areas of the climate challenge. And then that last area, which I've already mentioned, which is much more in-depth involvement through kind of community-run schemes, community-led housing schemes, the things like Swaff and Pride, which I mentioned as well. So it will be different things for different people, but there are kind of a whole number of ways which we can involve the public.
Right, thank you. A question from Tom Lowe, which is there a tension between the structure of a national energy retail market and the panel's strong view in favour of local decision-making and delivery of home upgrades? Louise, during 2020, did you manage to crack this when you were figuring out all the roles that need to shift?
Yeah, there is a tension. Because that market plows on, doesn't it? Like we've seen with the gas price hike. And while all the market signals are wrong at the moment, in that the levies sit on electricity, which is decarbonised so rapidly, and gas is still so cheap, again in inverted commas, and very aware of fuel poverty, it's hard to say if somebody said, oh, here's a local energy market, how that local market would operate in a big national market. It's a bit like a veg box scheme competing against the supermarkets, isn't it? So does it become a sort of nice to have choice, or do you have a sort of decent local market, and how do you have fairness? And it disincentivizes action. I mean, I could install a heat pump in my house, but my main big fear is that my electricity bill will shoot up through the roof. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. And I'm not sort of living in fuel poverty, although I'm freezing cold at the moment. So yeah, it's a hard one to tie up. I didn't solve that. But I think it comes back to local area energy planning and Ofgem moving a lot faster and letting more innovation happen.
Yeah.
I actually think the food analogy, as I do a lot of work in food, a food analogy is really quite interesting, because I might get my base load as such from Tesco, and there are other supermarkets out there if you wish, and I might get my sort of premium veg from the farmer's market, right? So what I don't think that we should say that national retailers are going to preclude this locality-based solutions. And they will have to adapt to those as well. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and. And if what you do is create a community environment where you actually end up being able to totally self-generate for yourself, fabulous. Then you don't need to call on that national retailer. But I think we're going to see many more sort of blended local national responses. And I don't think we should be worried about that. And I don't think it precludes, as I said, I don't think it's a zero-sum game on that, on those options.
Great, thank you. Chatty.
Just a very quick point. I mean, just looking at the existing measures that we're seeing in the UK on home retrofit, the single policy I suppose we've got remaining right now is led by retailers and suppliers. And it's got issues, no doubt, but the way the targeting of that scheme has now been moved to fuel poor homes 100%, I think is a good move. And how we use retailers and suppliers actually delivering scale on retrofitting, I think is quite a valuable thing to explore and exploit, I think, a bit more. There is that tension, I think others have touched upon that, but it's worth noting that the only policy we've got left right now that is delivering some measures at scale is delivered by suppliers and retailers.
Great, thank you. One question from LinkedIn user, I'm afraid that's all I've got, is there was some emphasis on skills and devolution in the government's levelling up white paper, but I was really surprised to see the absence of green skills and commitments connected to net zero. How should local authorities be supported with local skills improvement plans to fit the huge retrofit skills gap? And I know several of you touched on this during your opening comments as being a massive constraint on progress. Again, I'd be interested in your views on any examples of local authorities getting it right, but also what we can do to support local authorities. Who wants to jump in?
I'm happy just to say about bad experiences. So I remember in Broadstairs that the local FE college did a huge investment off the back of the Green Deal, and they put in a huge amount of money and really excited the locality and really sort of said they were going to become a green FE college, and then suddenly the Green Deal stops. So there is a lot of anxiety when it comes to FE colleges and the whole education sector about the longevity of these sorts of schemes. So I think that they absolutely need assurance that these schemes will be in place and that investment is going to be the right thing. But wider skills when it comes to energy planning, I think this absolutely should be a priority at university level, and I think we should be really turbocharging all our education systems to be looking at net zero. There's massive gaps.
Great. I'm going to actually end by drawing on a question. There was a question in advance from Simon Brammer, which was also about how do we ensure that local authorities and the communities they serve have the resources they need from central governments to achieve all the aims that you've discussed. Maybe I might just broaden it to ask every one of the panel to say, what's the one thing that they would suggest that central government does right now, or other institutions in the centre, to actually release power and actually catalyse more local action? Difficult final question. Where shall I start? Let's start with Luke.
I was very happy to go last when I was going last. It's so much easier. You can just vigorously agree with what everyone else has said, and then just have a couple of points. I mean, I mean, to be honest, this is probably the kind of the most obvious point, but it's been mentioned in various points. But increase the resource available to local authorities to actually. I mean, the budget for heat and energy efficiency, heat decarbonising and energy efficiency overall at national level isn't enough. Albeit there will be a lot of money that needs to come from private finance initiatives as well. So the government needs to increase the overall budget, it needs to devolve it, and it needs to be done in a way which means local authorities are not doing it through competitive bidding. One of the, local authorities have to be given these resources to be able to, yes, national targets, yes, national framework, but these kind of competitive bidding processes do not work. And we're seeing it, across a whole range of areas, and huge amounts of capacity are being spent by local authorities bidding for, a places fund, bidding for a jobs fund, bidding for a skills fund, bidding for a housing decarbonisation fund. All of that capacity should be turned towards actually delivering on the goals that these funds are there for. So increase the funding, devolve it, and then make sure it's not competitive, but give local authorities empower them to be able to deliver it in their own way, in ways which work for their local communities. I'm not sure whether that's one thing, but it's related to one thing, which is funding.
Louise.
Yeah, building on what Luke said. Yeah, I mean, I said that the one thing I'd do is make it a duty that everything you do in a local authority has to contribute to net zero and well adapted. But I mean, the LGA would shoot me for saying that, because it would have to come with the funding to deliver that. So and it would need an act of parliament. But what I'd say is, building on what Luke said, is let's get rid of the competitive and very short time frame to develop that funding, which means it's often farmed out to people, so the skills don't stay in house. The government has understood that now, so there's a bit more going in for capacity to develop proposals and plans and deliver them. But let's do it over longer time, so that funding then creates a rotating fund or a business, so that things become self-financing. So you don't just have to turn the tap of government money pouring out to local, that you can use it to set up much more sustainable business models. That then draws in that private capital, which we know has got to come in, and we know it's out there, and everyone's going, oh, there's all this money, we've got new projects to put it into. And the private capital needs to be a bit more creative about not waiting for really big, easy, simple, de-risked projects. They do it in the mortgage market. You've got a big can of money and it pours out to individuals. We now need that to be more flexible and in packages, and Nationwide do it. They do a green home loan thing, but they need to innovate to get smaller amounts of money out to deliver these messy, difficult projects. So it's not just on government and local authorities. It's on the business sector to be a bit more creative as well.
Thank you. Chatty.
So I suppose if I was in national government, I would be interested in putting out an open call to any and every local authority or combined authority to basically establish what others have touched upon, the one-stop shop model. It can vary according to different local authorities and their needs. Some might be more interested in a more sort of base model, let's say, and they're more interested in convening local authorities and others. Or others like Greater Manchester that might be interested in the whole doing everything in terms of retrofitting the homes themselves. And with a commitment to actually fund, or at least match fund or startup fund, or what you want to call it, support with resources to help establish those one-stop shops. I think they've proven to work in certain parts of Europe quite effectively. There's no reason why I don't think we can't borrow some of those ideas in the UK as well. And some local authorities and combined authorities already are doing that. So I try and turbocharge that if I was sitting in Whitehall and establish those one-stop shops across the country.
Great, thank you. Final word to Laura.
I have very little to add of the great ideas, and really like everyone's comments. I do think we just need to go back to this net zero piece of legislation, and so there does need to be responsibilities, and the devolution part needs to have what I would call long-term funding with key points of action where there is accountability. It does absolutely need to be funded, but we do need to ensure that the so-called laggards that Luke and I were talking about run to catch up. So timetable, money, and obligations.
Thank you very much to all the speakers, Chatty, Louise, Luke, Laura, and to all of you for joining, all the great questions and points in the chat. Please do take a moment to complete our short feedback survey, which we posted there. We will be sharing the recording and resources mentioned throughout the event, including things that, for instance, Louise mentioned that she'd written. And if you do want to sort of join us at future events, visit nesta.org.uk/events, and also follow the progress of the mission that we're on, all about trying to decarbonise UK homes. This is a really big question for us about what we can do locally and how we get the right balance between local and national action. So really appreciate everyone's comments and thoughtful responses. Have a very good day, and thanks for joining us.